really beautiful. And those are coming from the words of Rabbi Wallerstein, who I know, when we talk about addiction, is literally in the thick of it. It's in the thick of the matter, the thick of the suffering. My wife had the honor and privilege to work beside him for, I believe, 5 years. And when you talk about the pleasure of finding purpose and helping others, I just personally want to thank you for providing my family with that and giving us that opportunity. Several weeks ago, when Tzvi reached out to me and said, we're going to have a program that's going to take place upstate in Woodlake Village, my first initial response was, we're just going to be a bunch of buzzkills walking into the vacation. Everyone comes up to the mountains to escape reality. And we all know that reality is harsh. Life is harsh at times. Often it's harsh. So we create a little respite, a place to go to where we could go and relax. And I said, why would anyone want to hear about addiction? When they're sitting, they're relaxing, they're enjoying family. And I can't tell you this Shabbos how humbled I was by the response, by everyone's desire to say, what could we do? Tell us more. What's happening? And especially the reaction of, what can we do to help Klal Yisrael? And tell us more about the struggles that they're going through. And addiction, unfortunately, is really at the top of that list right now. I know Tzvi, he sends out these emails, and he needs to. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate receiving them, which talks about the lives that we've lost. This year, and it's hard for me to ask Tzvi for that number, and I won't. Because if I ask for that number, we're going to lose sight of what the real number is, which is 1. Several weeks ago, we lost 2 girls to overdose within a 2-day period. One of those girls was a student of my wife's who worked closely with her, was a student of Rabbi Wallerstein. And when we talk about numbers, whether the number be 50 or 100 or 200, in a short period of time, we lose sight of the reality of this is not a number, this is a daughter, this is a wife, this is a mother, this is a Rebbe, this is a friend. And when you go to a funeral of someone who's lost their life like this, the resignation, the loss, it's not an accumulation of people, it is simply one individual, a whole life that is lost because of this. Because, as Rabbi Wallerstein was saying, the discovering a way of life, forging a new path for yourself, which leads you down a terrible, terrible hole, which is so hard to get out of. But today we need to stand up and say, okay, what can we do? Explain. Let us learn about the problem, and then let us learn about some of the solutions, because we're past the time where we could sit back and say, it's not happening. It really is. This is happening in every community. This is happening in every age demographic, in all genders. This is happening to us, and we need to stand up. So let's talk a little bit about where this epidemic came about. As we all know, drugs have been around forever, and ever since they've been around, people have been abusing them. It starts with alcohol, moves on to the hallucinogenics, and pot, and all those other drugs. People have been abusing drugs forever, but we know in the past few years, the lives that we've lost have been significantly higher than virtually any other time in history that I could imagine. So we have to gain some perspective first. In the past 10 years, according to the CDC, there's been a 200% increase in overdose across America. Within that, we have a 600% increase in overdose related directly to heroin. And how did that happen? How do we arrive at a place where people are literally taking drugs to the point where they're killing themselves? And we know that it started in the early in 1995 is when the numbers started to increase, where doctors started prescribing opioids at levels that were never seen before. This last month was the first month since 1997 where we've seen a decrease in prescription of opioid medication. Since 1997, it's only been going up and up and up. And since these changes have happened, people and doctors are starting to get wiser and saying we're creating a problem. There's a real addiction epidemic that is being created as a result of all these opioids going out to the population. They started pulling back and saying we're not going to give them freely to people anymore. At that point, people started turning to the streets. And the streets, even though they're cheaper, they're stronger, they're more dangerous, they're laced with things that we don't really understand. And as a result of that, one bad batch can unfortunately kill friends, a group of friends. And that's where we are today in terms of our epidemic. But today we need to learn about change. It's really about change. We discover the problem, we talk about the problem only because we believe, and we wholesomely believe, that there's something we could do about it. I want to share with you something that happened to a good friend of mine, a high school friend of mine, who, a very special young man, a sensitive soul, and you'll find, for the people here who have worked with addicts, one of the landmarks of addicts is that they're very sensitive people. But here's a very special guy I went to high school with, who unfortunately, several months ago, we were there by his grave. And there's nothing worse than standing by a levaya that doesn't take place in a proper room. And it's beside a grave where a person, obviously something happened last minute, and there was an opportunity to pull things together. And there was so much that was shared about this young man. They shared about his life, and we cried together, and we spoke about who he was, and how he contributed to all of us, how he made us feel better about who we were. Lots of questions were asked, but no one asked why. All his good friends, his family, his parents, his rabbeim who were there, no one asked why, because everyone who was close to him knew him. And we've all seen him suffer. We saw him go through a divorce at a young age. We saw him struggle his way through high school. We saw him have a hard time getting a job, making friends, getting married, getting divorced himself. Anyone in seeing this young man understood his plight. As Rabbi Wallerstein said, when you enter into the world of addiction, it just changes your life. And we understood his plight, we understood his pain, we felt it along with him. So no one asked why. We didn't ask why because they understood. I worked at the Living Room for many years, which is a program for frum kids, for frum families who are in recovery. And a few weeks ago, they had a Shabbaton with over 100 people who were there. These are young men and women who are in recovery. They're part of this program. And we lost several people through the years that I was there. Speaking to the individuals afterwards and getting together as a group and just mourning this loss, there are no words to describe it. But the main thing that goes through it is an understanding that we get it. We understand what these people went through, what their suffering is like. And let's look at who goes into treatment. Who are these people? Maybe if we understand who's being treated, we could get a sense of where these people come from and what we could do for them. No one's really safe from addiction. Once you get introduced to something, it could turn into a problem for anybody. But if we work backwards, we might just gain some insight. So one of the most important studies was the study done by ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience Experiment, which looks at people and their life experiences in childhood and traces them throughout. And what they were able to show is that if a person has 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, like divorce, a parent who is struggling with an addiction, loss in the family, some form of trauma, that those people are much more likely than the general population to become addicts themselves. So that's just one idea that starts painting a picture of who are the addicts. One thing we know is that these are people that have experienced a lot of pain. From childhood, there's a building, a growing of pain that contributes to addiction. The APA published a study on PTSD where it says that nearly 50% of people who have PTSD also share a comorbidity with addiction as well. So it's just another piece to the puzzle. Childhood experiences, post-traumatic stress, PTSD, is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is basically an experience that has been traumatic in your childhood and your past. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child basically says that stress leads to adaptations in behavior and comfort-seeking patterns. The way Rabbi Wallerstein described it is beautiful. When people are in pain, when people don't feel comfortable, they gravitate naturally to something that feels okay. And when that becomes a pattern in your life, you're hurting, you're in pain, you're feeling something, and you've discovered the solution. When most people say, let me understand addiction, I say, imagine you've discovered the solution to every problem you've ever had. You discovered that there's this thing that you can engage in that will take away all the angst, it'll take away all the pain, all the suffering. And the addicts describe that experience for themselves. So the one thing that all these studies have in common are people that are in pain. I have never met an addict who's not truly, truly suffering in their addiction. Even though from the outside, it looks like it might be a person who's having a good time. It looks like they're okay. There's a lot of partying associated with it, especially with raves, as Bendel pointed out. But when you're talking about real addiction, it is literally day in, day out of suffering. I remember I was working at Ohel a bunch of years ago, and there was a new therapist who came onto the team, and we were talking about addiction, and she asked the question, she said, why would someone do such a thing? Why would someone who has a good life throw it all away to this world of addiction? Why would anyone do drugs altogether? Which is a wonderful question. It's a very healthy question. And I said, let's go for a drive. At the time, I was working with a at-risk school in Brooklyn. We were running groups once a week. And I just so happened to have known that during lunch, they would walk to a park. I believed it was on Amudim. They would walk to a park and smoke pot under a particular tree. And I said, let's go and observe this group of people and try to understand a little bit more about what addiction really is. And we sit there, and if you'd see any one of these individual kids by themselves, they'd all look miserable. Because when you're engaged in this behavior, you don't really feel good about yourself. You never feel comfortable with who you are. But there they were walking together, and one of the guys rolled a joint or whatever it was they were smoking at the time, and they started sharing it. And I said, and she's just through observation, she watched the experience of connection, the experience of comfort, the experience of acceptance, and she saw these individuals that left to their own devices would be very lonely and very afraid of this world. And there they were, in a group kind of engaging in an experience. Now those guys, I don't know if they ended up addicts in the end, but it was certainly the beginning. To them, the experience is something of comfort. It provides them with a relief from the world that they're living in. And the first thing that we need to just accept about the addict is that there are people that are just suffering. And this is an experience of relief that they go through. So acting out, the drug addiction itself is not the problem to them. The drug addiction is the solution. One of the first lines you'll hear from people if you go to any 12-step meeting, NA, SA, AA, you go to a meeting and people share their story. They call it qualifying, where they say, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, they want to share their personal story with people to say, this is where I've been and this is where I am today. And they go through their journey. But one of the themes that is so consistent, you'll find almost everybody shares their first experiences with drugs. Well, they'll say, I always felt different and uncomfortable until I had my first drug. And that was the first time in my life that I felt normal. Now, most of us feel normal, and most of us experience adversity. But it's not, and it doesn't take a substance for us to feel like we're okay. Yet addicts, because of the experiences that they have, it is precisely that drug itself or that alcohol that gives them a sense of I'm okay. I worked with a young man, this was actually Noel as well, I worked with a young man who was literally coming in off the streets, a heroin addict off the streets. He was homeless for a period of time, he was in and out of psychiatric hospitals, and he was struggling to get off the ground. And when I asked him about his first experience, I was first learning about addiction, asked him, what was it like? Tell me what did it feel like the first time you used heroin? And he said, just to quote him, and I asked at the time, I said, I need to write this down. And he said, the first time I used heroin, I felt as though the world was holding me. I felt comfortable for the first time in my life. Now, most of us, when you imagine a person taking heroin, that person is usually in an uncomfortable place. They're sitting in a foreign environment with a needle, with a substance that hurts as you insert it into your body. Yet his experience was one of comfort, of love, as if the world was holding him, and he felt comfortable for the first time in his life. Gabor Mate, a researcher and a therapist, a doctor out of Canada, he shared a line that to me always impacts me. He said, it's impossible to understand addiction without asking what relief the addict finds or hopes to find in the drug or addictive behavior. He said, the question is not what destruction does the addiction create in that person's life, but rather, what pain is it relieving? What is it giving them? Why is it giving them so much comfort? And if we could possibly understand why this thing, which is seemingly so harmful to everyone else, to this person seems comfortable, we might be able to connect. And by the way, that connection is so important. Study after study after study shows that addicts and I've heard them myself just from them, but aside from them, just the research, people who are able to connect and say, I get you, I understand. There was a study done by Miller and Rolenik in the 80s trying to look at what works, what helps addicts get better. We know they're the hardest population to treat. Only 90% of them, only 10% stay clean after their first time through rehab. They relapse and relapse and relapse. And these researchers wanted to figure out what works. And what they found at the end of the day, without going through the whole study, what they found is that relationships heal people. That a person who's going through addiction, who has a good, positive relationship with a parent, with a therapist, with someone who understands them, with a spouse, that is the beginning of healing. I remember I asked what they call an old-timer in the world of recovery. If anyone here were to go to a meeting, one thing you'll notice is that there's a lot of touching. There's a lot of holding hands at the end of meetings to say the serenity prayer. Even though you saw the person yesterday, you're still hugging that individual. Before the meeting and after the meeting, you're hugging that person. And I asked an old-timer once, who was there for 20 plus years, I said, why is there so much hugging? And his response to me was, he says, most of us were making up for the absence of hugs that we haven't received in our life. We hug because this is a place where we could feel hugged. It's a place where we could hug back and we could experience some type of connection. So what is addiction? Addiction is progression of use, unsuccessful efforts to stop and increase problems. I just sent a young man who I was treating in my practice. I just sent him to a rehab last week. And when he started looking at his journey, he's a young man, he didn't start using drugs until he was around 21 years old. He went through the system. He became increasingly withdrawn as the years went by, distrustful of teachers, of Rabbeim, of family, living very, very isolated. And he stayed away from drugs because he knew it was problematic. But all it took was that one opening, that one path for him. And once it started, it was like done before it even got off the ground. He started, he had that experience, and then several years later, he's now in rehab. And here's a guy, good yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, got a college degree, he finished up, but he reached out to me the other day right before he went to rehab, and he was trying to go clean by himself. And this guy, by the way, is not heroin, it's not heavy drugs, it's only marijuana. When we say only marijuana, but for him, that was the experience that he had, that was the drug that he connected with. And he said, I can't do this. When he started to go clean and have a day without being high, he said, I can't do this. And the reason being is because the experience of pain that he had to feel after trying to relieve it for so long, and he had to then live with himself and live with the distrust that he felt around him, was just too overwhelming for him. An addiction to drugs, even though in the moment it gives you a sense of relief, at the end of the day it never works. It just never works. You just go deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. And I remember I know time is against us at this point, but I remember a young man that I worked with who had spent many years abusing himself and abusing drugs. And he came to me after literally a daze. And he said, I looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in 5 years. And he said, what I saw looking back at me resembled nothing of who I was 5 years ago. And he goes, I couldn't even remember why I started in the first place. I lost touch altogether. The journey changes. You start because you're trying to resolve something, but once you're involved, it becomes a beast unto itself. It just perpetuates its own pattern and you can't get out until you move forward, until you have treatment. But this guy, by the way, I want you to know he's married, he has a few kids, and we need to know that, by the way, I should have said it earlier, that there's so many good people out there who are helping. There's so many communities, so many programs this year tonight, 3 organizations getting together, a community I can't say a bungalow colony, I found it, but it's a large house colony. I'm trying to figure out what the right word is. But this wonderful place of people saying, let's host an event, and let's try and understand this problem and deal with it. But people get better. I almost feel like we shouldn't only be talking about the suffering, we should also be talking about the healing. The treatment is very long. Tzvi might talk about it a little bit, but let's just talk about the areas that they're concerned about. And you'll notice that most of these are not just about getting off of drugs. The first step is getting off of drugs. You can't get better until you start facing life. But after that, it just becomes about living well. How could I contribute? How could I become a contributing member to society? How could I redevelop a connection with Hashem, with my family, with the people around me. Got to change your behavior. Learn to help others. The 11th and the 12th step of the 12 steps is just about giving back. And their belief, firm belief is, I cannot get better until I have a purpose that I could give over to others. It's not possible to get better until I have a mission. And it's a beautiful mission. And at the end of the treatment, what it all looks like, when all said and done, the amount of times, and at this point I'm no longer surprised hearing this, but it's still shocking to me that people say it. The amount of times that people say, I wouldn't trade my addiction for anything. Because it was my addiction ultimately that brought me to where I am today. And where I am today feels wholesome, feels good, feels connected, feels honest, feels real. And yes, I suffered for many years. But at the end of that suffering, it brought me to a journey that I needed to take. And that journey was life. And I feel good with my life today. People get better, as we see. I want to end with a research study which personifies to me what we need to do as a community. When they first started looking at the relationship between drugs and the brain, they discovered that it's a very harmful relationship. If you take drugs, they would put rats in a little cage, and they'd give them a lever, and every time the rat pressed the lever, they'd put heroin into the brain or cocaine into the brain. And they discovered that very quickly, these rats became addicted to the point where they were willing to press the lever enough times to kill themselves. Consistently, time and time again. And what they learned from those studies were that there's an addictive quality in the heroin itself or in the cocaine itself which kills people. There was a researcher in the 70s and 80s, Bruce Alexander, who wanted to understand this relationship between people and drugs in a more complex fashion. And he created a research study that's known today as Rat Park. And he said, let's look at drugs and the relationship with people not only in an isolated cage, but how does it work in an environment? And what they found is that if you give those same rats the same access to drugs, but you put them in an environment with relationships, with friendships, with support, so to speak. I know we're talking about rats, but whatever rat support looks like, they found that the percentages of addiction were significantly lower. That when rats needed to interact with others, needed to build relationships with other rats, they chose to forego the drugs in order to engage in a healthy way. And to me, when we talk about what we need to do as a community, when a person is alone, and the stigma of addiction creates this aloneness, they're afraid to come out. When a person is alone and isolated in their addiction, they are literally like a rat in a box. There's no one to talk to. There's no relationships to engage in. And the chances and the potential for that harming them to the point of death is very high. But if they exist in a community, and we become a community that understands, that opens our doors. I heard a story from a man today who was talking about a friend of his who has a child who's going through addiction. And the feeling, literally the feeling that I had of just knowing that this man who has a son who's going through addiction, but he has a friend in the trenches with him. He has a friend that he could call when he's not sure where his son is. And he has a person in his community that could reach out to and say, I don't know what to do, I'm lost. That father is not alone. And by that father not being alone, the child is not alone. And the chances of that kid getting better is significantly higher. So we as a community, number one, accept that there's no way to avoid the reality of the acceptance of a real significant problem. We know the numbers, we see it all the time. But try and work towards creating a community that is comfortable enough to create events like this, to talk about it, to share and say, okay, we're coming out of the woodworks, we're talking about it. And hopefully by doing so, Hashem could guide us and bring us to a place where we're healthy and comfortable and connected and as far away as possible from the suffering of addiction. Thank you so much for having me.